In those first two modules of this lecture, we've been exploring BonJour's contention that coherentism is unfairly given short shrift in the epistemic literature, that it is all too often introduced as a mere rhetorical foil for the purposes of arguing for some alternative conception of justification. And indeed, if one takes coherentism's rejection of basic beliefs to make it equivalent to that second option in the epistemic regress argument, the circular regress, then we may well be tempted to conclude that it's not a particularly promising theoretical perspective from which to formulate a theory of justification. With our debate so framed, we are now going to pivot starting in this module and devote our attention now to looking at BonJour's positive account of justification. We'll see that BonJour has a fourfold account of justification. He calls it 4 arguments. I call it 4 steps. We could think of it as 4 sources from which an individual belief can draw justification under his account. There is local linear inference, that justificatory transfer via inference, but BonJour restricts that to local inferences. That is, if we call a belief into question against the backdrop of a belief system, then BonJour thinks it's perfectly legitimate and commonly done for us to call upon other beliefs within the system, use those as premises in an inference to justify that belief locally. But as the calls for justification for beliefs start to turn into a regress, start to become more and more of the belief system, BonJour thinks that we switch to a different mode of justification. We consider the system's systematic coherence. That is it a coherent belief system? And we start to evaluate the justification of the system itself instead of looking at justificatory links between individual elements of the system. In examining the systematic coherence of the belief, we also need to take into account its relationship to other plausible belief systems that are available to us. So we have to be sure that our belief system is as coherent as any other system that is available to us. And finally, we see the individual beliefs as justified because they are embedded in a coherent system that is as coherent as any other system, embedded in the sense that we can linearly justify them with reference to other beliefs in that system. Once we've established and discussed BonJour's theory of justification a little bit, then we'll turn our attention to the traditional arguments that are often offered up against coherentist views. And we'll see how BonJour understands those arguments and where he thinks they attack his theory. In the final part of the lecture, of course, we'll see how he defends his theory against those arguments. And those arguments are pretty standardized. There are 3 traditional arguments that are offered against coherentist theories in the literature, and BonJour talks about each of them. The first one simply asserts that coherence is a fairly cheap commodity. Belief systems being coherent isn't at all uncommon. Lots of people have coherent belief systems that can't all be true because they're at least partially inconsistent with one another. The next objection that we'll consider is that coherence is actually a relationship between beliefs, and so it doesn't connect anything besides beliefs or the system. It doesn't relate those things to the world itself, and so there's no belief world connection that would allow us to have confidence that our beliefs, in virtue of being coherent with one another, were actually more likely to be true. And finally, we'll consider the objection that coherence isn't shown to be truth conducive. That is, having coherence isn't necessarily going to make our belief system more likely, even if it were to connect us to the world. So let's get right at it and start looking at BonJour's positive account of justification. As I said, BonJour claims that a full and explicit justification of a particular belief involves the following 4 distinct steps of argument. The first step is the step that we'll recognize most clearly from our discussions about foundationalism. It looks like that linear inferential transference of justification from one belief to another. So he says inferability of that particular belief from other beliefs and further inference relations among particular beliefs. The idea here is that individual transfer of justification from one belief within our system to another belief within our system is perfectly legitimate and in fact does enhance the justification of any particular belief when that justification is called into question. However, BonJour limits the scope of this kind of inferential justification. He claims that as we start to question more and more beliefs, as that inferential regress starts to include more and more of our belief system, that the emphasis shifts and we switch into another form or another argument by which we justify beliefs, and that is to assess the coherence of the overall belief system. So if you just question one belief, or two beliefs, or three beliefs, or four beliefs, then perhaps inferability of those beliefs from other beliefs within the system will be the strategy that we employ to establish their justification. But once many beliefs start to be called into question, BonJour thinks, once the scope enlarges beyond just an isolated case of justificational query, we then move to this other alternative assessment of the beliefs and of the system overall. So we look at the coherence of the system overall. Now, BonJour doesn't offer a substantial notion of the coherence relation, as this is really a schema for a theory in that way. But coherence is not mere consistency, he tells us. It comes in degrees, and it is closely connected to the concept of explanation. But the role here is what we'll want to focus on. So when we start to see more beliefs being called into question within a particular belief system, BonJour thinks that we start to consider whether or not the system in which those beliefs are embedded is a good system, is a justified system, and to evaluate that, and hence to evaluate the justification of particular beliefs that we might be questioning, we go and evaluate the overall coherence of that belief system. Is it a coherent belief system? And again, we don't have a precise specification of what that would amount to, but it's not just that it's consistent. It will come in degrees. There'll be greater or lesser degrees of coherence, and it is somehow connected to the notion of explanation. So it has to help us to make sense of things, I suppose. If we then think about, well, coherent belief systems, those are good, but what about other alternative systems? So for instance, if I have a scientific theory and I have problems with my scientific theory, I might mess around with the theory. I might consider whether or not the theory itself is consistent and does a good job of explaining the data. And I also might consider alternative theories. And so another argument for the justification of a belief via its belonging in a belief system is a consideration of a justification of the overall system of beliefs in relationship to other possible belief systems. And so for BonJour, this involves citing the system's coherence, showing that it is as coherent as any available alternative, and showing that it includes some beliefs about sensory processes that are reliable. Finally, BonJour suggests that in addition to these features that contribute to the justificatory status of individual beliefs within a belief system, there is also the justification of the particular belief in question by virtue of its membership in the system. And I think what he means by this, and how it's supposed to differ from one, lies in the idea that while one establishes a justificatory transfer from one belief to another within the context of the system, and then gives us that perspective on the individual belief that we justify that it's more likely to be true given those beliefs, this combines the elements of the other three steps together so that we see that the belief is permissibly inferred, as we did in one, but we also see that it's permissibly inferred within the context of a coherent system that is at least as coherent as any other available system. And so in this way, I think BonJour understands this step as the cognitive possession of all elements that contribute to the overall justification of the belief. And it's this unification, this recognition that they're all together, that itself contributes even more to the overall justification than any individual component thereof.